Welcome to the forgotten hollows of Appalachia, where whispers of a cursed family still linger in the misty valleys. The Clawbend family, long shrouded in secrecy, were known for their grotesque fused hands, knuckles twisted and fingers curled like talons. Townsfolk spoke of strange noises from their decrepit farmhouse, shadows moving behind cracked windows, and an attic that no one dared enter. Some claimed they heard scratching at midnight, as if something unnatural was trying to escape. What was the origin of their deformities? Was it a cruel twist of nature, or something far darker, inherited through generations? Tonight, we pull back the veil on the Clawbend's horrifying legacy, a tale of obsession, isolation, and secrets so grim they were buried along with the family. Chapter 1. Imagine the rugged, mist-clad ridges of Appalachia in the autumn of 1885, where the air smells of damp pine and the wind whispers secrets older than the mountains themselves. Nestled in a narrow valley, hidden from the main trail, stood the Clawbend farmhouse, a crooked structure of rotting wood and moss-streaked shingles. Locals would cross to the other side of the hollow in passing, muttering about the family who lived there, and about the hands. No one spoke freely of the Clawbends, and for good reason. Rumors claimed that their fingers were fused, curling into grotesque claws. Children were warned never to peek through the fence, and travelers would swear they could see shadows moving behind the windows even when the house appeared empty. Some nights, a faint scratching echoed from the attic, so persistent that it seemed to claw at the very walls. The patriarch, Jeremiah Clawbend, was a towering figure, stooped slightly by years of secrecy and labor. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was in a voice that seemed to scrape the very soul of the listener. His wife, Eliza, was gaunt, her movements deliberate, almost ceremonial, as though every step she took was part of a ritual no outsider could comprehend. Together, they maintained a strange order in the house, a rhythm of isolation, secrecy, and silent dread. On my first visit, the hollow seemed almost alive. The wind carried whispers through the trees, leaves rustling as though warning me to leave. Yet curiosity pushed me forward. I noticed the attic window, cracked slightly at the top, revealing nothing but shadows. There was a sense of something waiting, just beyond reach, and it felt as though the house itself breathed around me. As I approached, a chill ran down my spine. The ground beneath my feet felt uneven, almost clawed, and I could swear I saw shapes moving in the corners of my vision. The locals' warnings echoed in my mind, but a deeper fascination rooted me in place. What secrets were hidden within that attic? What had caused the Clawbends to become the way they were? Before we continue with the story and unspeakable secrets, I want to ask something important. This channel is not for everyone. Only the bravest souls who dare to confirm the darkest chapters of Appalachia's hidden history. If you made it this far, you are not like most people. You understand some truths are too horrifying to ignore. So hit that subscribe button and join our community of true mystery seekers. And tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? Are you brave enough to hear a story like this from your own backyard? Next we discover, as I finally decide to step closer to the attic, a shadow shifts within the dim light, and I hear a sound no human hand could make. Chapter 2. The Attic of Whispers. The air around the Clawbend farmhouse seemed heavier the closer I drew to the attic. A faint, musty odor drifted from the upper floor, a mix of damp timber, old fabric, and something else I could not name, something almost alive. The small attic window, half hidden behind sagging curtains, revealed nothing but darkness, yet I could feel its gaze upon me, patient, calculating. I climbed the narrow staircase, each step groaning under my weight, echoing like a warning. The wood was warped and slick with age, and I had to brace myself against the railing to avoid slipping. The shadows danced across the walls, as if the house itself were breathing. My heart thudded in rhythm with the scratching that had haunted my approach, soft at first, then growing louder, sharper, like nails against the wood. When I reached the landing, the attic door loomed before me, a simple, peeling slab of wood, yet it radiated an almost magnetic dread. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the rusted handle. A whisper, or perhaps a sigh, escaped from the other side. It was human-like, yet distorted, stretched as if the sound had been trapped for decades. I turned the knob slowly, half expecting it to resist, and pushed the door open. The attic was smaller than I had imagined, filled with shadows that seemed to twist and fold upon themselves. Cobwebs hung like tattered curtains, and old trunks and crates were stacked haphazardly, covered in dust and time. But it was the center of the room that drew my eyes. A single large chest, its lid slightly ajar, revealing darkness beyond comprehension. As I stepped closer, the scratching intensified, coming from within the chest itself. My instincts screamed to run, yet curiosity anchored me in place. I could see shapes moving inside, indistinct but deliberate. Fingers, claws. My mind recoiled, yet I could not turn away. The air was thick, almost viscous, pressing against my chest, and I felt an unbearable tension, as if unseen eyes were boring into my soul. A sudden creak made me spin, and for a brief moment I thought I saw movement in the shadows along the rafters. The attic seemed to pulse with life, an entity born from years of neglect, isolation, and secrecy. I realized then that the Clawbend's deformities, the fused claws, the whispered warnings, they were not merely rumors. They were part of something older, something hidden from the world for a reason too terrible to articulate. I took a step back, almost tripping over a loose floorboard, and the chest seemed to shift subtly, as though acknowledging my presence. The scratching paused for a heartbeat, and then resumed, faster, frantic, deliberate. The attic had secrets, and they were ready to reveal themselves. Next we discover. As I lean closer to the chest, the shadows twist into a form I cannot yet comprehend, and the sound of the claws scratching becomes almost intelligent.
Disclaimer: this story is purely fictional. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is entirely coincidental.
Chapter 3. The Chest That Breathed. The chest in the center of the attic seemed almost alive, its edges warped, as if the wood itself had been tortured over decades. Each inhale of dust-laden air felt heavier than the last, pressing against my lungs. The scratching had paused, replaced by a soft, almost rhythmic tapping, like claws drumming a slow warning. I could feel the attic watching me, waiting for my next move. Compelled by a mix of fear and curiosity, I stepped closer, peering into the narrow gap in the chest's lid. The darkness inside was thick, impenetrable, yet I sensed movement, something coiled, hunched, waiting. My hand trembled as I reached forward, fingertips brushing the rough wood. A cold, wet sensation met my skin, and I jerked back in shock. It was real. Something real was inside. The shadows around me seemed to respond to my hesitation. Shapes stretched along the rafters, lengthening, folding, shifting with unnatural precision. The air grew colder, and a whisper curled around my ears. I could almost make out words, broken fragments of a language I did not know. "Do not open. Do not see." The voice was hoarse, cracked, but undeniably human. I forced myself to focus. A faint glimmer caught my eye from inside the chest, something metallic, reflecting the dim light filtering through the attic window. Slowly, cautiously, I lifted the lid further. My breath caught as I saw the contents, a bundle of old yellowed cloths tied tightly. Beneath them, what appeared to be hands, fused, clawed hands, knotted and twisted in ways that no natural deformity could explain. I recoiled, yet I could not look away. There was a pattern, a grotesque symmetry that suggested intent. These were not accidents. The claws were carefully preserved, almost ceremonial, as if someone had purposefully hidden them here, away from prying eyes. My mind struggled to comprehend the possibility, the Clawbend's grotesque hands, the attic's whispered secrets, the shadows that moved in unison. It was all connected. A sudden creak of the attic floor made me spin, and for a fleeting moment I thought I saw a figure crouched in the darkness, hunched over, its arms long and sinewy. My heart hammered as I realized the scratching, the tapping, the whispers. They were not echoes of the past. They were warnings. Something alive, something deliberate, had been waiting for me in this room. The attic seemed to pulse around me, as if the house itself were a living entity, and the chest, its beating heart. I could feel the claws within it twitch, almost as if aware of my gaze. I stepped back, shaking, unsure whether to flee or stay. Curiosity held me, but a deep, instinctual fear pressed down harder than the air itself. Next we discover, as I finally consider closing the chest, a long, deliberate scratch echoes from above, and the shadow shifts, revealing a shape that is neither fully human nor fully beast. Chapter 4. The Shadow in the Rafters. The attic had shifted from eerie stillness to a charged, almost sentient tension. The shadows seemed to pulse along the rafters, stretching and bending like dark fingers reaching for something or someone. My eyes darted around, trying to discern shapes, but the dim light and drifting dust made every movement a threat. Then a sound, low, deliberate, and heavy, echoed above me. A scraping, like nails against the old beams, coming closer. My pulse raced, every instinct screamed to run, yet my legs refused to move. The attic was not empty. Something waited, something patient, something aware. Above me, a dark figure emerged from the rafters. Its form was hunched, limbs elongated, and bent at unnatural angles. The shadows clung to it, obscuring its face, but the movement of its hands, long, knotted, clawed, was unmistakable. It was the very embodiment of the Clawbend's whispered legend. Every scratch and creak of the attic floor seemed orchestrated, deliberate, as if this being had been lying in wait for decades, hidden in plain sight. I could hear a faint, raspy breathing that seemed to match the rhythm of the shadows themselves. It moved with eerie precision, balancing on the beams, its claws tapping in irregular, hypnotic patterns. I realized, with a sickening clarity, that these were not just hands. It was the same deformity that had haunted the family line, preserved in living form. The attic was not merely a hiding place. It was a sanctuary for whatever had survived, whatever had inherited the curse. The air grew colder still, pressing against my chest, making each breath a labor. A beam shifted overhead, casting a stark shadow on the chest below. The clawed figure paused, almost studying me. I could feel its gaze, though its face remained hidden. Something ancient and deliberate simmered in the darkness, a sentience that seemed to measure my fear, weighing my resolve against its patience. I wanted to retreat, to slam the chest closed and flee the house, but my curiosity was a stronger tether than fear. My hand inched toward the lid again, shaking, every nerve screaming against the inevitable. The figure above moved, descending slightly from the rafters, the claws scraping the wood with a sharp, metallic sound. My stomach churned. I was on the precipice of witnessing a truth far darker than legend. A sudden gust of wind blew through the attic window, scattering dust and old papers, and the figure recoiled, vanishing momentarily into the shifting shadows. The silence returned, heavier, thicker, suffocating. I knew it had not left. It was watching, waiting. Next we discover, as I finally dare to lift the chest lid again, A glint of movement catches my eye, and I realize the claws within are not entirely still. They twitch as if alive, and the shadow crouches, ready to strike. Chapter 5. The Twitching Hands. The chest sat in the center of the attic like a dark altar, its contents alive with silent menace. I could no longer deny it. The hands inside twitched subtly, curling and uncurling as though sensing my gaze. A chill ran down my spine. These were not mere relics of the past. They were something preserved, something waiting. I hesitated, fingertips hovering above the rough wood of the lid. Each instinct screamed to retreat, yet curiosity was a stronger tether than fear. Slowly, carefully, I lifted the lid wider. The light from the attic window fell across the bundle inside, revealing the hands fully, knotted, fused, claws sharp, grotesque in their unnatural symmetry. They moved with deliberate, almost intelligent motion, flexing as though testing the air. Then, above me, the shadow shifted again. The figure crouched in the rafters had descended closer this time. Its elongated arms and clawed hands mirrored the twisted shapes below, a living reflection of the horror hidden in the chest. I realized with a cold dread that the Clawbend's deformities were not simply disease or accident. They were legacy, embodied in both flesh and shadow. The air thickened around me, carrying the faint, metallic scent of old iron and something far fouler, like decay preserved in the cold. I could hear faint scratching, soft, deliberate, almost conversational, as if the hands were aware of my presence, communicating in their own grotesque language. My pulse raced. The attic seemed to pulse with anticipation, each creak of the floorboards like the beat of some monstrous heart. The shadow above shifted its weight, landing lightly on the beams. The claws scraped against the wood, sending sparks from the old nails embedded in the floor. My breath caught. It was testing me, measuring my courage against its patience. I felt an instinctive pull toward the chest, as though the hands themselves were drawing me in. I leaned closer, unable to resist. The bundle wriggled, curling upward slightly, and I caught sight of a pale, twisted knuckle moving independently. My stomach churned. The attic was not just haunted by memory, it was alive. A vessel for the Clawbend's curse, a tangible, breathing relic of generations long hidden from the world. A sudden gust from the cracked window sent dust spiraling, and the shadow recoiled into the corner. Silence returned, thick and suffocating. The hands lay still again, or at least they appeared so, but I knew better. The twitching was deliberate, and the shadow was patient. It would not leave. It had been waiting decades for someone to witness its presence. Next we discover, as I gather the courage to touch the hands, a sudden, sharp movement makes me stumble backward, and I realize the shadow has shifted closer than I ever imagined, its eyes glinting in the dim light. Chapter 6. The First Touch. The attic seemed to lean closer, the shadows pressing against the walls as though they had weight. My eyes were fixed on the chest, on the twisted clawed hands that twitched beneath the dust-stained cloth. A voice inside me, a mix of curiosity and dread, urged me forward. I couldn't stop myself. My hand trembled as I reached for the edge of the bundle. The wood was cold, almost slick beneath my fingers. Slowly, I lifted it just enough to brush the surface of the cloth covering the hands. Instantly a shiver raced through me, sharp as a blade. The fingers beneath the fabric twitched violently, curling as if gripping for something to hold. My heart thundered in my chest. Above, the shadow shifted, descending a little closer. I could feel its presence like a physical force pressing against me. Its claws scraped the beams above with deliberate precision, and I realized it was watching, waiting to see my reaction. The hands, grotesque in their fusion, seemed to respond to the shadow, flexing, testing, acknowledging it as master and me as intruder. I gathered the courage to peel back more of the cloth. The hands were worse than I could have imagined, Knuckles fused in unnatural angles, nails thick and curved, joints swollen, veins blackened with age. Yet there was something almost sentient in their movement. They twitched, flexed, and curled as if alive, testing the air, responding to the tiniest vibration of sound or breath. A strange sensation ran up my arm as I hovered closer. The attic air felt electric, alive. The shadow above hissed, a sound like air drawn through broken teeth. The hands inside the chest twitched in near-perfect unison, almost as though the shadow and the hands shared some unspoken connection. My stomach churned. The Clawbend's curse was no mere deformity. It was a living, breathing entity, hidden for decades in isolation. I froze, hand inches from the first clawed finger. The shadow shifted slightly, sending a small cascade of dust from the beams above. Its movement was deliberate, a silent warning. My curiosity warred with instinctive terror. Every fiber of my body screamed to step back, to flee the attic, but fascination rooted me in place. I finally dared to make contact. My fingertips brushed the cold, knotted flesh. A shiver shot through me, unlike anything I had felt before. The twitching intensified, curling around my fingers like a living, probing presence. The shadow above hissed again, closer now, as though acknowledging that the boundary had been crossed. Next we discover a sudden sharp crack from the rafters makes the attic floor tremble, and the shadow lunges, revealing its twisted clawed form fully, inches from my face. Chapter 7. The Lunge of the Shadow. The attic seemed to hold its breath. One misstep, one careless motion, and I feared the very air would turn against me. The shadow above, once distant and deliberate, had shifted closer, its elongated, clawed form descending with terrifying precision. The flickering light cast grotesque shapes on the walls, making the figure appear larger than life, impossibly twisted. A sudden crack echoed through the attic floorboards. Dust fell from the rafters like frozen rain. My eyes widened as the shadow lunged. Not slowly, not deliberately this time, but with sudden, terrifying speed. The claws struck mere inches from my face, scraping the wood with a sound like steel against bone. My chest tightened. I stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding the full force of its strike. The hands in the chest twitched violently, curling as if mimicking the shadow above. The attic seemed alive, pulsing in rhythm with the creature's movements. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet my feet felt glued to the floor. The air smelled of iron and decay, thick and suffocating, pressing against my lungs. I could hear the faint, irregular scratching of the claws moving across the beams above, and my stomach churned in visceral terror. The shadow's eyes, or what I assumed were eyes, glimmered faintly, reflecting the light in the attic. They were not human, not entirely. They were old, patient, and cruel, watching me with a calculated hunger. It hovered just above me, a living embodiment of the Clawbend's curse, a manifestation of decades of secrecy, isolation, and deformity. I forced myself to take a step back, nearly tripping over a loose floorboard. The shadow recoiled slightly, then advanced again, deliberate, as if testing my resolve. The hands in the chest twitched faster, their movements almost intelligent, curling toward the shadow's rhythm. It was then I realized. The shadow and the hands were linked. One cannot move without the other. The curse was alive, interactive, and it had been waiting for someone foolish enough to witness it. A cold gust swept through the cracked attic window, sending a swirl of dust and cobwebs around us. The shadow paused, crouched on the rafters, claws flexing, as though weighing its next move. My heart pounded in my ears. Time felt suspended, each second stretched thin and taut, like a wire ready to snap. I knew then that leaving was not as simple as stepping backward. The shadow, the attic, and the twitching claws were aware. They would not let me leave without acknowledging their existence, without confronting the truth of the Clawbend's legacy. Next we discover, as the shadow lunges again, a sudden flicker of movement from the chest catches my eye, revealing the hands may not be confined to the wood at all. Chapter 8. Hands Beyond the Chest. The attic was no longer just a room. It had become a living trap. The chest before me, once a horrifying curiosity, now seemed like a conduit, a bridge between the cursed Clawbend's legacy and the present. My eyes widened as the hands, once confined beneath layers of cloth, began to stir with an unnatural energy. They stretched, knotted fingers unfurling slowly, like dark smoke made flesh, reaching toward the edge of the chest. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, as one clawed hand slid over the wooden lip. Its movement was deliberate, intelligent, curling outward, probing the air. A soft, wet scraping sound followed, the sound of nails dragging across old wood. The shadow in the rafters shifted, watching in silence, its eyes reflecting a cruel, patient intelligence. The attic felt suffocating now, the air heavy and charged with anticipation. The hands moved faster, their twisting motion more coordinated, almost purposeful. One hand reached toward my sleeve, brushing against the fabric with a cold, clammy touch. My skin crawled. I could feel the pressure, the subtle, probing curiosity of something not human. My instinct screamed to flee, yet my gaze was locked on the movements, hypnotized, unable to look away. The shadow above descended a fraction, claws flexing in perfect synchrony with the hands below. It was a mirror of the chest's grotesque appendages, a physical manifestation of the family's curse. The attic was no longer a passive space. It was alive, interactive, and aware. The hands seemed to respond to my presence as much as they did to the shadow, their reach growing bolder, more deliberate. A cold gust swept through the window, rattling the fragile panes and stirring dust motes that danced like spirits in the dim light. The hands paused momentarily, almost recoiling, before inching forward again, their movements eerily patient, studying me, testing me. The sound of their nails scraping against the floorboards and chest was hypnotic, terrifying, impossible to ignore. I realized then that these hands were not remnants of the past. They were the present, a living continuation of the Clawbend's legacy. Each movement seemed calculated, almost ritualistic, as if decades of isolation and secrecy had honed them into a single, terrifying purpose. And the shadow above was their guide, their master, or perhaps a part of them, an extension of the family curse itself. I could feel my courage fraying, each second stretching longer than the last. The hands twitched again, testing the limits of their reach, probing closer, while the shadow crouched, silent and ready to strike. The attic had claimed me as an observer, and now it demanded acknowledgment. Next we discover, one of the clawed hands suddenly leaps from the chest, curling around a loose beam above, and I realize the attic itself is alive, a conduit for the curse, ready to envelop everything in its path. Chapter 9. The Attic Grips. The air grew thick, almost viscous, pressing against my chest, as if the attic itself were alive, closing in. The clawed hands had left the chest entirely, slithering across the floorboards and curling around beams like dark, twisted serpents. One hand snapped upward, grasping a loose rafter above me with a wet scraping sound that made my stomach turn. Its movement was unnervingly deliberate, testing the boundaries of space, probing for weakness. I tried to step back, but my foot caught on a splintered board. Panic surged. The hands reacted instantly, twitching and curling with uncanny intelligence, as if sensing hesitation or fear. I stumbled, my hands gripping the chest for balance, and in that moment, one of the clawed appendages shot toward my ankle. Its touch was icy, clammy, and it wrapped around my leg like a vice, holding me fast. Above, the shadow crouched low, eyes gleaming faintly in the dim light. It had moved closer, its elongated limbs flexing in tandem with the hands below. Each tap and scrape of the claws against wood seemed purposeful, orchestrated, like a conductor guiding a symphony of terror. I could feel the rhythm of the attic itself, pulsing, alive, demanding attention, demanding submission. The hands on my ankle twitched again, curling upward as if to pull me closer to the chest. The claws scraped and flexed, probing the fabric of my clothing, cold and hard, unyielding. A primal fear clawed at my mind. I was no longer merely an observer. The attic had made me part of its design, part of the Clawbend's legacy. A low, almost growling hiss came from the shadow above. It tilted its head slightly, watching me struggle. The movement of the hands below and the shadow above were perfectly synchronized, a grotesque mimicry of life. My pulse raced. I realized with bone-deep dread that escape was not an option, unless I understood the rules of this place, if there were rules at all. I strained against the grip, heart hammering, sweat prickling my skin. The hands tightened slightly, testing my resolve. Every instinct screamed to flee, to fight, to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence of the attic, by the ever-present, living shadows. In that moment, a small glint caught my eye, a pale, twisted knuckle moving in the chest, twitching with a life of its own. The hands above and below seemed to draw strength from each other, communicating in a silent, horrific code older than the house itself. I understood, with chilling clarity, that the Clawbend's curse was not dormant. It was patient, waiting for the right moment to strike. Next, we discover. As the shadow leans closer, a single hand from the chest reaches out toward me, hovering in the air, and I feel an almost sentient pull, drawing me into the center of the curse itself.
Did you know while the terrifying hands of the fictional Clawbend family are imaginary, there are real congenital conditions where fingers are fused or malformed? One of the most common kinds is called syndactyly, where two or more fingers fail to separate during development in the womb, resulting in webbed or fused digits. In medical literature, this occurs in about 5 to 10 per 10,000 live births and can affect both hands. Some forms involve only skin, while others involve the bones themselves. There are also documented cases of more complex hand malformations. Combinations of fused fingers, syndactyly, and extra fingers, polydactyly, described in clinical reports. And sometimes these patterns run in families, suggesting a genetic component. Across human history, isolated populations with limited gene flow, for example, mountainous or rural regions, have sometimes shown higher rates of rare inherited disorders. One historical report from geneticists noted increased occurrence of birth defects in certain Appalachian community due to small, isolated family groups.
Chapter 10. Drawn into Darkness. The attic seemed to exhale around me, a heavy, suffocating presence pressing from every corner. The clawed hands had fully left the chest now, their long, twisted fingers curling toward me, probing, almost beckoning. My pulse pounded in my ears as a creeping, visceral dread settled over my chest. Every instinct screamed to run, but my body felt anchored, trapped by invisible forces. One hand reached out, hovering just inches from my shoulder. Its movements were deliberate, almost coaxing, curling with subtle intelligence. The shadows above shifted in tandem, the elongated form crouching, watching, waiting. The attic had become a predator, and I was caught in the center of its gaze. I stumbled backward, but the floor seemed uneven, almost clawed beneath my feet. A sudden gust of wind from the cracked window sent dust swirling like restless spirits, and in that shifting haze, the hands from the chest flickered closer, twitching with uncanny awareness. They were not random. Every motion had purpose, every curl a silent command. The shadow leaned forward, its glowing eyes fixated on me. I could see the reflection of the twitching claws in its gaze, a mirror of the horror below. The hands reached higher, fingers flexing like dark steel. The air grew colder, thicker, pressing against my lungs. Breathing became a labor, and my heart threatened to burst from sheer terror. I realized then that the attic itself was a conduit, a living, breathing extension of the Clawbend's curse. The hands were its tendrils, the shadow its guardian, its master, or perhaps its soul. My curiosity had drawn me into a trap decades in the making. And now the full weight of the curse bore down on me, unseen but undeniable. A sudden scraping sound from the beams above made me flinch. The shadow had shifted again, lowering its claws in perfect harmony with the gaze. Hands reaching toward me. I felt an almost magnetic pull, as if the twisted appendages were tugging at my very essence. My fingers brushed against one of the clawed hands, icy and unyielding. A shock ran through me, a mixture of fear, revulsion, and a strange, inexplicable compulsion. I could feel my balance slipping, my senses warping under the attic's oppressive presence. The hands moved faster, curling higher, guided by some ancient, invisible rhythm. The shadow crouched lower, its elongated claws flexing, ready to strike, or perhaps to claim me. Next we discover, one of the hands suddenly grips my wrist with astonishing strength, pulling me toward the chest, and I glimpse the shadow's form fully, its twisted, clawed figure poised to merge the past and present into a living nightmare. Chapter 11. The Shadow Revealed. The grip on my wrist was iron tight. The hand that had lunged from the chest seemed to pulse with life, each movement deliberate, calculating. I was being drawn closer to the heart of the attic's darkness, the chest now a looming altar beneath the shadow above. Every instinct screamed to pull away, but the strength of the clawed hand was terrifyingly absolute. The shadow leaned fully into view, crouching low on the rafters, its elongated arms flexed unnaturally, claws scraping against the beams. The dim light caught the twisted curves of its face, partially obscured, yet horrifyingly human in its resemblance to the Clawbend's legend. Eyes glimmered with an unnatural, patient intelligence, watching, weighing me as though I were a puzzle to be solved. I could feel the hands in the chest twitching in response, curling upward in unison, reaching toward the shadow and toward me simultaneously. The attic seemed to pulse around us, walls bending slightly in the flickering light, floorboards groaning like joints under immense weight. The air was thick with the metallic scent of iron, old decay, and something else I could not identify, something alive, almost sentient. My wrist throbbed under the hand's grip, icy yet strong. The clawed fingers flexed, testing my resistance, probing for weakness. Above, the shadow crouched, poised like a predator about to strike, yet its movements were calculated, deliberate. I realized with mounting horror that the hands and the shadow were not separate entities. They were extensions of the same ancient, cursed essence. The Clawbend's deformities, once whispered about in local lore, were alive, embodied in flesh and shadow, spanning generations. A sudden scraping echoed through the beams. One of the hands leapt from the chest, landing on the edge of the floorboard beside me. The claws scraped deliberately, then extended toward my other arm. My pulse raced. The attic was no longer just haunted. It was sentient, alive, aware of every heartbeat, every breath, every tremor of fear. The shadow tilted its head, almost inquisitively, as if testing my resolve. The hands moved faster, curling, uncurling, flexing in patterns I could not comprehend. I understood then. The Clawbend's curse was patient, meticulous, waiting for decades to trap someone foolish enough to witness it, and I had walked willingly into its web. A low, guttural hiss emanated from the shadow, echoing through the rafters and across the chest. The hands twitched violently, wrapping together, almost forming a single unified mass of grotesque claws. I realized the full scope of what I faced. The past and present were merging here, in this attic, in this very moment. The Clawbend's secrets were alive, and they were focused entirely on me. Next we discover. The shadow descends fully toward the chest, merging with the twitching hands, and I am pulled into a terrifying vision of the Clawbend's ancestors, the origin of the curse revealed in all its horrifying detail. Chapter 12. The origin of the curse. The shadow and the hands moved as one now, a terrifying, writhing entity that seemed to pulse with centuries of hidden history. As I was drawn closer to the chest, the attic itself seemed to shift and warp, the air thick with the weight of untold secrets. My vision blurred at the edges, the dim light flickering as if reacting to some unseen force. And then I saw it, a vision, almost like a memory carved into the very walls. The Clawbend's ancestors stood in the same hollow centuries before, their hands twisted and deformed, their movements unnatural. A strange ritual was underway, the air heavy with incense, smoke, and whispers of a language long forgotten. I realized with mounting horror that the deformities had not been random. They were the result of obsession, isolation, and dark hidden practices meant to bind the family's lineage to some inhuman purpose. The ancestors' hands, like the ones in the chest and the shadow above me, twisted unnaturally, curling into claw-like forms. Their faces were gaunt, eyes hollow, and their bodies seemed to merge with shadows, hinting at the very origin of the attic's sentient darkness. Each generation had inherited the curse, passed down not through disease or accident, but through intent, through secret knowledge, ritual, and isolation. I staggered back, heart pounding, as the hands in the chest twitched violently, reacting to my realization. The shadow above crouched lower, its glowing eyes reflecting the visions I was forced to witness. The curse was patient, yes, but it was intelligent, adapting, preserving itself through centuries of secrecy. Every claw, every fusion, every shadowed movement was a deliberate act of survival and terror. A sudden creak made me whirl. The attic floor seemed alive, the dust motes swirling in patterns I could not comprehend. The hands from the chest reached it higher, curling like serpents, wrapping around the edges of the chest, as though pulling the history into the present. The shadow descended slightly, claws flexing, guiding the appendages in a rhythm I could feel, not just see. I realized with bone-deep dread that the Clawbend's curse was not confined to flesh or shadow. It was memory made manifest, a living, breathing continuity of terror. The attic itself was a vessel, the chest its anchor, the hands its instruments. And now I was a participant, drawn into a story centuries in the making. My breath caught as the shadow hissed low, the sound vibrating through the beams, the walls, the chest, the very air. The hands twitched violently, flexing toward me, and I understood. They were testing, judging, and perhaps offering a choice: witness the legacy, or become part of it. Next we discover one of the hands lashes toward me suddenly, and the vision of the ancestors collapses into a tangible, present threat, forcing me to confront the full, horrifying power of the Clawbend's curse. Chapter 13. The Curse Strikes. The attic had transformed completely. Dust swirled in unnatural patterns, the shadows stretching and twisting as if alive. The hands from the chest had fully extended, writhing like serpents, each clawed finger twitching with deliberate intent. The shadow above crouched low, its glowing eyes fixed on me, following every tremor of my body. The air was thick and suffocating, each breath a labor, each heartbeat echoing in the vast, oppressive silence. Then, without warning, one of the clawed hands lashed out. Its movement was lightning fast, curling around my wrist with crushing force. A cold shock ran through my arm, radiating to my chest and spine. Panic surged through me, yet the hand's grip was unyielding, intelligent, almost deliberate, as though testing my strength, gauging my reaction. The shadow lunged from the rafters simultaneously, claws scraping the beams, landing lightly but menacingly beside me. I realized with mounting terror that the hand and the shadow were extensions of the same malevolent entity. The attic itself had become a predator, the Clawbend's curse fully awake and aware of my presence. I struggled against the grasping fingers, but the hands twisted, curling tighter, pulling me closer to the chest. Their movements were synchronized with the shadows, an unnatural harmony that made the room feel alive, sentient, malevolent. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, my mind racing for a way to escape. The weight of centuries of secrecy pressed down on me, a force almost tangible. Above, the shadow hissed low, a sound like air through broken teeth, and I felt the attic vibrate with the rhythm of its pulse. The hands beneath my arms flexed violently, as if mirroring the anger and intent of the shadow above. I realized with a shiver of pure dread that the Clawbend's curse was not a passive horror. It demanded participation. It sought witnesses, intruders, those who dared observe the darkness. A metallic scraping echoed from the beams, and the attic seemed to tilt, the floorboards groaning under invisible weight. My vision blurred, dust and shadows mingling into a surreal haze. The hands pulled harder, curling around my wrists and ankles, lifting me slightly off balance. I could feel their cold, clammy texture, the unnatural rigidity of their fused joints, the sharp clawed tips grazing my skin. The shadow descended fully, crouching close, its glowing eyes fixed on me. Time seemed to stretch, every second pregnant with the threat of inevitability. I was caught in the center of centuries-old terror, the culmination of the Clawbend's grotesque legacy. Escape seemed impossible. Resistance felt futile. Next we discover. The hands tighten their grip, and the shadow arches forward, and I am drawn into the chest itself, witnessing the living horror of the Clawbend's curse in its most terrifying tangible form. Chapter 14. The Heart of the Curse. The hands tightened their grip, cold and unyielding, wrapping around my limbs like living steel. The shadow leaned fully forward, its grotesque, elongated form filling the dim attic, casting every surface in flickering, monstrous patterns. I was suspended between the chest and the rafters, caught in a web of centuries-old terror, the weight of the Clawbend's legacy pressing into my very soul. Then, a sudden, sharp motion. The chest lid shifted violently. The hands beneath it writhed as if alive, stretching and curling higher, climbing the edges, reaching toward me with unnatural precision. I felt their fused fingers brush against my face, cold and clammy, testing the boundaries of human fear. The attic seemed to breathe with me, the air thick and pulsing, as if the walls themselves were aware of my presence. The shadow hissed, low and guttural, a sound that reverberated through my chest. It arched over the chest, claws flexing, eyes glowing with intelligence older than time itself. The hands twitched violently, curling in perfect synchrony with the shadow's movements. I realized, with a clarity that sent ice through my veins, that I was not facing mere deformities or legend. I was confronting centuries of deliberate horror, an inheritance of darkness passed down through the Clawbend's line. A surge of panic drove me to struggle, but the hands held firm, and the shadow's gaze seemed to pierce my very mind. Images flashed before me, ancestors in shadowed rooms, performing rituals in whispered languages, the first fusion of clawed hands, preserved through the generations, the isolation and obsession that had shaped this terrible lineage. The attic, the hands, the shadow, they were not separate. They were one living, breathing curse, perfected through centuries of secrecy and terror. I felt myself drawn closer to the chest, to the re of the curse. The hands wrapped fully around my wrists and ankles, lifting me slightly, the coldness of their flesh seeping into my skin. The shadow crouched, descending, and the chest seemed to pulse beneath me, a heartbeat older than the house itself. Time stretched thin, every second an eternity of terror and anticipation. Then the hands paused, twitching in unison, and the shadow leaned back slightly. The attic's oppressive pulse remained, but there was a sense of judgment. The curse had tested me, drawn me into its history, forced me to witness the full extent of its darkness. I realized that survival would require respect for its presence, acknowledgement of its power, and the understanding that some legacies are never meant to be unraveled. Slowly, the hands retracted, curling back into the chest, and the shadow ascended into the rafters, watching, waiting. The attic exhaled, the oppressive air lightening just enough for me to step back, heart pounding, shaking, yet alive. The Clawbend's curse remained, patient, eternal, a living history preserved in clawed flesh and shadow, and I had been granted a glimpse into its heart, a glimpse I would never forget. The end.